right, we're looking at the idea of God as spirit, which is attributed to Jesus in from the Gospel of John, and that's what we're going to talk about. But as we're going through this time together, just kind of think about what that means to you, and how do you reconcile that? You know, I was raised in a traditional religious or Christian background. And I was raised to, I don't know that anybody ever set me down and said, God is this old man in the sky, but you get that impression. And probably from all of the artwork and just the fact that God is spirit, and they who worship God must worship him in spirit and truth. You know, that's, that pronoun is used all the time. So our mind goes there. And so the challenge for us is to look at ideas like this. What does this mean, and how could it be practical to us if God is spirit? Last week I talked about the second coming and some of the problems with that, a revisitation of that idea. And this week I was happened to catch on the internet a woman from Ukraine who has picked up a rifle and is engaged in the Russian invasion, defending her country. She said, we appreciate all your prayers, but we would much rather like you to send us ammunition and weapons. And that's exactly what I was talking about with how a message from Jesus that is centered on go within yourself, find that connection with God. While at the time the Gospel of Mark came out, the Jews were under severe persecution. They were being attacked exactly like the Ukrainians are right now by the Russians. And I would just say, let's all hold the Ukrainians and the Russians in our prayer time, because I don't think the average Russian person is any more interested in this situation than the Ukrainians are. So it's a situation that is going on, but it illustrates very well how a spiritual message can get lost when you're under fire, when your country's under attack like this. And all the spiritual principles that we talk about are fine, but we've got the enemy standing at our door. And we need to do something about this. We need help with this. And so I completely understand how a spiritual message can get lost in the heat of battle, in the heat of an attack like this, because it doesn't seem real practical. You know, we could all send notes to the Ukrainians and say, don't forget, you know, Jesus said, go into your inner room and shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Does that mean the Russians will not be there when they open their eyes, when they go outside? Probably not. And so what they're looking for is they're in a state of mental survival, literally. And it puts people in a different place where all of, often our religious beliefs are most challenged during a moment of crisis. And in that regard, it's a positive thing. When we're pushed to the end of our faith, then we find the strength that we didn't know we had. And that's one thing that I'm impressed with these people that are average citizens taking up the call to defend their country. And I wish this kind of thing didn't happen. You know, don't we all? I wish we were past that. But when you have a sociopath as a leader in a country, you've got a psychopath in charge of that kind of power. You're going to have this kind of thing. And if you go back and look at history, you'll find that every great, so-called great empire was expanding. And what does that mean? You know, we say that as a way of just, well, they expanded because they were great. Well, they weren't necessarily great to the ones they had to walk over to expand. You know, they had to capture people. They had to enslave people. In Jesus' day, about 3/4 of the population were slaves. And that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So what he was talking about was something on one level that doesn't seem to have a lot of practical application on another. And we would have to back up and say, okay, God is spirit. What's God going to do about all this? And it won't appear that God's doing anything because the military is too strong. You know, the battle is raging and destruction is occurring. So none of the spiritual ideas we talk about seem real practical. But it's also interesting to realize that, or to find out, I think it was Brother Lawrence, who is one of the great mystics, had his deepest, greatest spiritual revelation on the battlefield when he saw a tree that was stripped of its leaves. It was wintertime. And it occurred to him that the time would come when the leaves would begin to come again, that there's a living force there, even though it does not appear that it's present. And that was his awakening as bullets were flying over his head. And I didn't even know that about him. I didn't know he was in any kind of military service, but very deep understanding of this individual. So we're kind of challenged with this whole thing. How practical is the spiritual approach to life? And do we just say it to make ourselves feel good, or do we really employ it? Do we really bring it to the forefront of our minds? When we say that one of the attributes of God is power, well, we can imagine the Ukrainian people having to reach within themselves and finding that power, finding more power than they realized they ever had, power that manifests in the form of strength. And it's often when we're pushed past our limits that we find our greatest strength. It's never fun, is it? It's never comfortable. It's the exact opposite. We would like a spiritual life that creates a cushion. And it just never has seemed to do that. Jesus was under attack from day one. You know, if you follow the gospel accounts, he never really was at peace. As a child, story goes that all the babies were slaughtered because they thought this special person was born and would pose a threat to the Roman Empire. And all through his life, he was attacked, according to the stories, and finally he lost. At the end, was murdered. So he did not have a life of peace. But he said, "My peace I leave with you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you." He's talking about something else. He's talking about a different level of experience. And that's what this kind of thing pushes us into. We try to pray and keep our world on an even keel, and when our worst nightmare occurs, that's when we open ourselves to deeper things, often, after we kick and scream for a while. It's just kind of an interesting thing to observe. So we're looking at this idea of God as spirit. And Jesus said, or as John has him saying, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So it's hard not to use the male pronoun when we're talking about God, because we don't really want to say it. God is an it. That doesn't feel too good. We can say God is father, mother, he, she. That feels a little awkward to me. And I don't quite go along with the God is a him. But it's something that, you know, the whole Old Testament and New Testament came out of a male-dominated culture. At least they thought they were dominant. I don't think they actually were. I think the women were actually in charge. But that's where it comes from. And so it's, when you grow up with that, it's kind of hard to, we could refer to love as it. We could say God is love, and when we talk about love, we could say love is it. But it's hard to do that with God. So we use these things and we translate as we go. God is omnipresent, which means everywhere present equally at the same time. And that idea is well worth meditating on. Just take that into your time of meditation. God is omnipresent, everywhere present, equally at the same time. So that means God is present right here, right now. The understanding of God as omnipresent makes the condition of separation impossible. And we are taught that sin has separated us from God, that we're born in sin, that sin goes clear back to Adam and Eve, goes back to the first man and woman. And we have inherited that, and we're born into sin. And that whole idea of sin is separation. It's the belief that we're separate from God, because if you're saved from your sins, that means you will reunite or unite with God when you leave this body. But in the meantime, you're separate. But the idea of omnipresence does not allow for separation, because if you were separate from God, that would mean you are the one place in the universe where there is not God. God is not present where you are. If you are, all of humanity is separate from God. It does not, omnipresence, the concept of omnipresence does not allow for this. And I've heard people try to get around that by saying, well, God knows all about you and where you are and all of that, always hears your prayers, and like this all-knowing mind is always aware of you. But that's not the same as being in and as you, as expressing in and as you. It's similar to the sponge in the water, you know, that's immersed in the water's in the sponge is in the water. Illustration I've used many times because I think it's so graphic. Such a graphic, good illustration. That you think of God in that way. God is the very life force, the creative life force, the energy that is my being. And I can never be separate from that. If I was ever separated from God, I would evaporate. I would cease to exist. So thinking of God as spirit makes it easier to grasp the idea that the energy of spirit can be present everywhere. When I think of God in a human form of some kind, I think of him as off someplace. But as Jesus said, God is spirit. I can then say that spirit is like an energy that permeates all things. That can be everywhere present equally at the same time. And so I can get that concept. I can grasp that idea. And to worship God in spirit it's an intuitive awakening. It's an inner experience. There's a word I have shared with you before, and you probably heard it, but it's a kind of a weird word to us today, although it's regaining popularity. It's called panpsychism. It's the understanding that mind rather than matter is a fundamental feature of the universe. It's referred to as the world soul. And of course, the Gospel of John refers to this as the Word. The Word is created all things, and nothing was created that was without the Word. And that's the idea of the world soul that was embraced. And this was considered the default philosophy in 19th century Western thought. That the thought was there's something underneath the visible world. There's something underneath materialism. And science comes in, science steps in and begins to think that the ultimate reality is matter. And so they begin to define everything in light of that. And so this idea that there is an invisible something under that which we see, it was kind of just swept under the carpet. It was abandoned, not by everybody, but by mainstream science. Materialism. They call it physicalism now. Physicality, physicalism. So this little illustration over on the right is shows a woman at the center of this circle, and that's it was a drawing done 1600 something, by Robert Flood. So the world soul is depicted as a woman. I like that idea. We think of Father God, Mother Nature. I could even put that together to make that work, because you've got this invisible energy working through the material level, the female side, that's giving birth to all that we see. Might make that some topic sometime. Current developments in the fields of neuroscience, psychology, and quantum physics have revived interest in panpsychism. The exploration of what modern philosophers are calling the hard problem of consciousness is causing some scientific heads to turn back in this direction. And this is David Chalmers. He's an Australian philosopher and cognitive scientist that coined that phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. And what he is talking about here is scientists are taking a look at how does consciousness work? How does our being work? How is it that there is this invisible something that is making the physical work? What is consciousness? And they're trying to figure out the mechanism that consciousness can work through. Again, material science says that consciousness is a product of the brain. But there's a great deal of research going on in these different fields that say consciousness can exist outside of the brain. And that's how I ran into this term through the near-death research that I do. This is a question that cannot be answered by material scientists. When you've got a patient undergoing surgery on the table, totally knocked out, and they report seeing the surgery occurring from the ceiling, and they remember it, and then they have further experiences beyond that. The most famous case of scientific interest is that of Pam Reynolds, who was actually put to death in the operating arena. She had her eyes taped shut, had her ears plugged in with speakers that were beeping all the time to monitor brain waves, which there were none. They brought her body temperature down to something like 60 degrees. They basically killed her because she had an aneurysm on the brain that they had to drain all of her blood to open her skull and do surgery on that aneurysm, and it was way at the base of the brain. It was very dangerous, and the chances of her surviving that were pretty slim. But with her eyes taped and her ears closed and she was knocked out, she was able to describe to the doctors the tools they were using, what they were saying to each other. She saw the whole thing. And the surgeon, main surgeon, said that would be impossible. But she did it. She described the saw that they used to cut open her skull. And none of the instruments were brought out while she was conscious, just to keep everything sterile, according to the surgeon. That was just common practice. But she was able to describe that instrument that would have been something she had never seen in her life. So the question here is, how does a person experience something when they're not in the body? How can consciousness have memory? Where is our memory? If it's not in the brain, because the brain was dead in that moment, she was flatlined totally. There were instruments keeping her alive. But when she was finally revived, she didn't want to come back into her body. She said it was freezing cold, and it would be 60 degrees. But they'd brought her temperature up somewhat. But there's been several cases like that, and it just cannot be explained. And doctors that do not want to believe it's possible for consciousness, or scientists that don't want to believe that, just give some other explanation. She was dreaming or hallucinating or whatever, but that doesn't add up. So that's the hard problem of consciousness. What is consciousness? What are we? What is this thing that we are? And it's something more than the body. Most of us don't ever experience something more than existence in the body. Although if you want to look at some of your dreams, we probably go out of our body. I don't know exactly what we do when we dream. But they say that is, if we're going to astrally travel, that's when we do it. But I have no difficulty at all thinking that I have a body. I'm not my body. That it's not my brain that generates consciousness, although it seems like all of my awareness is up here, right where the brain is. And so it's very easy to associate that with the brain, consciousness in the brain. But I also know that I can say I am not my body, I have one. I have a body that is like a garment. And I believe the people that say they've had these incredible out-of-body experiences. I don't believe every one of them, but you can tell when stories are genuine. You have to kind of sort through them. But it is, that's the hard problem, is how does that work? If you are a material scientist, how would that work? And there are too many stories, too many cases now where we just cannot dismiss that as irrelevant, as hallucination or whatever. So the Greek word pneuma means the vital spirit. It's an ancient Greek word for breath, the vital spirit, and soul. Anytime you read the word spirit or breath in the Bible, that the Greek word, the Greek equivalent is pneuma. And of course, I've explained that before. You are all familiar with a pneumatic staple gun. That's where it comes from. It's an air gun. And it's tied to this idea of breath, the breath of the Almighty, spirit. It's pneuma. God is spirit. God as spirit is like the wind that blows. You cannot see it. This is what Jesus said. You cannot see it, but you can feel it on your face and see its effect in the swaying branches of a tree. Spirit is the creative life force that is the underlying reality of all things. And the creative life force is a term I've come up with, but interestingly enough, I saw it used by a guru in autobiography of a yogi. I just happened to be looking at that a couple of weeks ago. I have that book at home, and I've never read it. So I listened to it, and then I decided to kind of flip through it and saw one of the gurus use that term creative life force for this thing we call God. And I thought that was a good thing. But I like it because it's this idea, it is creative. God as spirit is pushing in and through us all the time. And I've said many times, we desire more because we are more. That spiritual energy that is God in us is expansive. That's why Jesus gave so many illustrations, I think, so many parables on the expansive nature of things. The grain of mustard seed, the smallest of all, but it expands to the greatest of herbs, or the yeast, the leaven, that you put in flour and water, and it expands. The wineskins, new wine. You don't put it in an old wineskin. Most of us are not familiar with all that stuff, but we know that if you make wine, it ferments, and that means it expands. So it has to have room to expand. If you put it into something that's already fully expanded, it'll break, which is what he said. He would have been very familiar with that analogy. So what is that new wine, and what is that old wineskin? The old wineskin is our old consciousness, our preconceived ideas. It's the materialist scientist saying consciousness is generated by the brain. I can't think anything beyond that. Every explanation I come up with is going to come back to that. So he cannot possibly take this new wine of maybe your consciousness and your body are not one and the same thing. Maybe your consciousness is actually generating your body, producing it, sustaining it. Maybe there is something that is more real than your body and your brain. And a person can experience brain damage, and it will look like they can't function, but people, even in comas, will come back and say, you know, I heard everything that everybody said when I was in a coma. I saw all the people that came into my room. I saw and heard all the conversations in that room and in the room down the hall. And they will say they could have been in a coma for 5 years and say they remember all of the experiences that people around them did not think they were conscious of. So the brain has been shut down, but the consciousness has not. So when we say God is spirit, we associate that aspect of spirit, or that aspect of ourselves, with this idea that there's something that is more real than what I have thought, and that something is me. And I am an expression of this invisible force that is spirit, that is God. I'm not all of God, but I am an expression of that. And maybe that word is a little hard to use in that context, so come up with something like the creative life force. I'm part of that. I'm an expression of that. To me, the hard problem of consciousness doesn't exist. I don't know how life jumped into the material level and sparked it to make it, to animate it. I don't know how that happened. And frankly, I don't really care how it happened. We know it's happening. It's going on. And maybe it's my lack of scientific training that says it's okay that I don't know that. I don't know how that works. There's a lot of things I don't know, but there are things I do know, that I am one with this creative life force that we call God. That I'm part of that, and I am an eternal being. I know that at the very depth of my being. I don't have faith. Remember, I said faith in religious terms is theory in scientific terms. Knowing. We come to know through direct experience that we're one with this larger context. This thing we call spirit. God is spirit. But Jesus points out that we can't see it. We can see the effects of it. So we see the effects of it all over the place, not just in blowing leaves. We see it in all the living forms. But we get so into the living forms, that's what we call reality. But there's something beneath that. And that's why it's so important that we re-examine how we think of God. If we're still thinking of the old man in the sky thing, and that's very easy, it's a knee-jerk reaction most of us have if we were raised in that way of thinking. That's how we think of him, think of God. It is, and when we pray, we often look outside of ourselves. I need help because I don't have the thing I need. So I need help from someplace else. And it's an interesting thing that we all have to deal with in our own way. And maybe we're very comfortable with the old man in the sky. A lot of people are. So I wouldn't challenge anybody to rethink that. But if you're trying to work out this hard problem of consciousness, if you understand that we all live in a field of energy, even the material realm is energy. Nothing is solid. You get down to the very smallest view of it. If you have a microscope, super microscope that allows us to look at any material object, we'll see there's more space in it than there is material. And I can't even comprehend that. Then to say God is spirit is not much of a leap. It's all that space, all that energy woven throughout matter. And it's here now, it's present. Not something that will come in the future. God is energy. Our previous religious indoctrination may make it difficult for us to think of God as omnipresent energy. If we start from the basis of God as spirit, however, the transition is not so challenging. To worship in spirit is to become intuitively receptive to the ever-present life, love, power, and intelligence that presses in upon us. I would like to give a talk specifically on intelligence. I think I'm going to do that next week. Talk about instinct, intelligence, intuition, and all the things that are involved with intelligence and how that expresses through us, because it's a very important idea. But if we see ourselves immersed in God, when you pray, you don't have to get God's attention. You already have it. That's why we talk about affirmative prayer. We affirm. I don't ask for more strength or more power. I affirm that the power that is here is now expressing in greater degrees through me. I embrace the truth of what is here and see myself expressing that truth. And that's a very big difference than from saying, I don't have power. I'm powerless in that regard, so I need some extra power sent in my direction. We simply attune to the power that's here, and we become empowered through that knowing, that inner knowing. It was the mission intention of Jesus to persuade people to understand that they can know God firsthand, and that to love God with all their heart, mind, and soul is the path that leads to the spiritual awakening we all crave. That's why it's important for us to take a statement like he put out, God is spirit. What does that mean? What does that mean in my time of crisis, in my time of when I don't know what to do, when I am not comfortable with, when I'm feeling powerless? How do I take a concept like this, God is spirit, and make it meaningful in this now moment? That's the challenge we all have. And it's worth asking ourselves, looking at in all the ways we can possibly imagine. All right. Thanks for coming out. And good to see all of you here.
3, 4. Skies and puffy clouds, couple little kids, an old dog running around. There's a bunch of yellow wildflowers, some humming honeybees. I saved a little place, you and me. And take it a day to find the time to breathe. Open the cage, let my mind fly free. I'm sitting by this stream with sweet melody, watching the ripples and feel the breeze. I'm writing a song about mountains strong and tall, with shoulders to lean on if I ever think I'll fall. There's a fast running river there, wash my cares away. A shady little hollow where we can play. I'm taking today to let the past just be. I've opened the cage, let my mind fly free. I'm sitting by this stream with sweet melody, watching the ripples and feeling the breeze. Struggled way too long, trying to find a place where I belong, until I realized right here and now, here I open my eyes, I'm sitting on sacred ground. cage. Let my mind fly free, sitting by this stream, this sweet melody, watching the ripples and feel the breeze. I'm watching the ripples.
You've been watching a talk given by Reverend Doug Bottorff here at Independent Unity in beautiful Grand Junction, Colorado. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us spread our message. If you would like to support us, you can do so by clicking the button in the right-hand corner of the video screen. We greatly appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching.